With the recent criticism of 8GB graphics cards, I've been getting some questions about whether it's better to buy a used RTX 3060 12GB card or buy an RTX 5050, or I've even seen some people wondering if they have an RTX 3060, would it make sense to upgrade to a 5050? Well, is it an upgrade? As you can see here, in game settings that overwhelm the 8GB of VRAM, the 3060 is indeed faster. But if you switch over to settings that are not overwhelming the VRAM capacity, the 5050 is on average faster, although by how much? Well, I just ran a crazy number of benchmarks, and what do they tell us? So this is the overall average FPS results in all the benchmarks that I ran. I tested out a bunch of the biggest releases of 2025. So we're focusing on new games released this year, because I think that's the best way to judge how things will move ahead going forward. And we tested at 1080p and 1440p at native resolution, but also using upscaling. So we're using DLSS balanced at 1440p in addition to testing native, and we're using DLSS quality at 1080p in addition to testing native. Also, to deal with the VRAM capacity issue, I've tested games at both their maximum graphics preset, but also their medium graphics preset. And that allows us to sort the information a number of interesting ways, because as you can see here, the 3060 in red is often ahead, but also the blue, the 5050, is often ahead. Now this tends to correlate with whether we're at maximum settings or at medium settings. So for example, if we look at the average FPS in maximum settings, it looks like this, and we can see that in the majority of the situations, the red bar is ahead, sometimes very noticeably so. However, the blue bars do get some leads in certain titles. Those titles are also where the overall FPS is higher, and that's also tending to be where the graphics settings are turned down. If you look at the 60 FPS line, what I think you'll really see here is that neither of these GPUs are particularly suited to playing games that just released in 2025 at their maximum graphics settings, even using upscaling. That's what we're really seeing here. However, if you look at it as an average FPS result and an FPS percentage difference, so what this chart is looking at is the it's telling us the percentage advantage for the 3060 over the 5050. So for example, in Monster Hunter Wilds 1080p max, the 3060 was 19% faster. That's what that means, not 19 FPS. And a negative result indicates the 5050 was faster. So this is like in Clair Obscur Expedition 33 at 1080p max settings using 67% upscaling, which is the quality level upscaling. We're seeing that the 5050 was winning, and the 3060 was losing by 16%. That's how you can read that negative side of things here. So the geomean, the average of all of my tests at maximum settings, actually shows the 3060 18% faster. But is the 3060 actually 18% faster in raw performance? And the answer there is no. If we switch out to medium graphics settings, we see these results. One thing that we'll notice is that the overall frame rate numbers are a lot higher. Playing at medium settings instead of maximum settings is certainly an easier thing to do on your GPU. But then also we'll notice that the blue bar is generally ahead. That is the RTX 5050 here, other than like one spot where they basically tied in Oblivion Remastered at 1440p. With medium settings. Again, if we look here, the 50 FPS line is here. So a lot of these results are above 50 FPS, sometimes 60. And if we want to think of that in terms of an average performance difference, we see that the RTX 5050 is generally winning. Remember, the negative result is the percentage deficit for the 3060 when the 5050 is winning. So the 3060 only gets very few and they're small wins when we're talking about medium graphics presets, because generally we're now getting 8GB of VRAM under control and we're talking more about the raw performance of the graphics cards. So by raw performance, the average is that the 5050 is 11% faster. So now, what does all of this actually look like broken down by monitor resolution? So let's take a look at that. So If we were going to use the RTX 3060, for example, at maximum graphics settings at 1440p, it certainly does better than the 5050, but it also doesn't do particularly well. So this is maximum settings at 1440p. You can see that absolutely none of the games reach 60 FPS, although we get close in Final Fantasy VII Rebirth using upscaling, and that's an Unreal Engine 4 game, so despite releasing in 2025, that's really not pushing the latest graphical boundaries the way a lot of the other ones do. So in general, neither of these GPUs are a good choice for playing maximum settings on a 1440p display, even if you're using like DLSS balanced at 1440p, which actually makes the internal rendering resolution far below 1080p even. Now, if we go to the average difference, though, the 3060 is 30% faster. So neither card's doing well here. The 3060 is 30% faster, but that's mostly because 1440p max settings in the newest games is very, very frequently going well over 8 gigabytes of VRAM, and that's just crippling performance on the 5050. But in general, again, looking at this chart, we see that overall performance was low enough. Guys, a lot of these are like at the 20 FPS line. It's not a good experience. These really just aren't the settings you would use on these GPUs. So what if you were thinking, though, a lot of people say that 8 gigabytes of VRAM is still good enough for 1080p. Well, if you're playing the newest games, that's not necessarily true. So new AAA games do often go beyond 8 gigabytes of VRAM at max settings, even at 1080p. So really, again, these cards are in a tough spot. The 3060 just doesn't have the overall performance you would need for max settings, and the 5050 doesn't have the VRAM, or really the performance anyway. Now, we can see that some games do hit 60 FPS here. We're seeing Clair Obscur Expedition 33, but that's using quality level upscaling on 1080p to get there, and only, interestingly, the 5050 is actually getting to that 60 FPS line, because it is, when not running out of VRAM, faster than the 3060. We're seeing like Doom the Dark Ages, again using upscaling, is getting around 60 FPS. Final Fantasy VII Rebirth hits about 60 FPS even without upscaling, and upscaling pushes it beyond 60 FPS. But all sorts of games, like Monster Hunter Wilds, even using upscaling, we're falling short of 40 FPS on both GPUs at max settings. Spiderman 2, using upscaling, can get the 3060, beyond 40 FPS, so it's kind of playable, but you're certainly nowhere near 60 FPS, and the 5050 is choking on VRAM. In general, what we can see here is just these GPUs aren't really in the performance tier, and the 5050 doesn't have the VRAM for max settings. If we look at it as a percentage advantage, the 3060 is averaging 7% faster at maximum settings, again, just due to the fact that the 5050 is having VRAM-related issues. Now, if we instead go to medium settings, though, and then break it down by monitor resolution, again, medium settings is a lot to look at. We've got 1080p and 1440p upscaled and not. So if we instead sort it out by monitor resolution, are these cards appropriate for a 1440p display if you tune it down to medium graphic settings? That's certainly an interesting question. Well, what do we see here? Well, this is the 75 FPS line, and we get some titles even hitting that number. This is the 50 FPS line, which I would deem on a variable refresh rate display. You're not going to notice a massive difference between like 50 and 60 FPS. So on more budget-oriented cards, I think hitting around 50 FPS on a variable refresh rate display in brand new AAA games isn't awful or anything like that. We can see that Monster Hunter Wilds still can't get there on these cards, even at medium settings, even using balanced level upscaling on a 1440p display. Spiderman 2 can get to right around 50 FPS at medium on native, but using upscaling actually makes it a good experience, getting to 75 FPS on the 3060, and the 5050 not too far behind. Oblivion Remastered, again, can't get there on native medium settings, but using upscaling pushes it into playable territory. Kingdom Come Deliverance 2 is playable at native and a nice 75 FPS plus on both cards using upscaling. Assassin's Creed Shadows is well below 50 FPS without upscaling, but medium settings with upscaling does get you a good experience, actually, especially on the 5050 here, where it takes a decent lead. And Clair Obscur Expedition 33, yeah, you're well short of 50 FPS on native medium settings, but using balanced level DLSS is pushing it well beyond 60 FPS. Doom the Dark Ages can go beyond 60 FPS, again at medium settings using upscaling. And again, Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, medium settings are okay, using upscaling probably a little bit better here. So these cards aren't completely out of place on a 1440p display if you understand that in the newest AAA titles, you will be turning down to lower presets. Medium seems to do okay here. There's probably more optimized settings you can do on a game-by-game basis, and frequently also using balanced level upscaling. So my main concern with that is just that means you're already turning down a lot of the settings, the graphic setting preset and using aggressive upscaling. So there's not a lot of headroom for games getting more demanding in the future and still having a good experience. Again, we're talking about the newer AAA titles. If you're playing older games or if you're on, mostly playing esports stuff, both of these cards will be a lot more at home. Now, if we're looking at the average performance difference then, so if you were considering, okay, playing at those reduced settings, which GPU does a better job, the 5050 is 11% faster at 1440p using the medium presets and using the combination of native resolution and balanced level DLSS. To be clear, no DLSS frame generation is used in any of the benchmark charts here. Usually if you achieve a decent base frame rate like 50 to 60 FPS, you could then turn on frame gen to smooth things out on a high refresh rate display. But you want to achieve that decent level of base performance before kicking on the frame generation. Now, what if you're on a 1080p display? Well, here's the average FPS for 1080p medium settings, and we can see that again, the 3060 in red is generally behind, and we can also see that both GPUs can do okay here, right? We're looking at mostly native results here, by the way. I only threw in a couple of upscaling results here for the medium setting. So if you're looking at playing these at native resolution on your display, you're probably going to have to be going for like 1080p medium on the newest AAA games. Again, older games you can probably max out and run at high refresh rate. Esports titles, same thing. But new AAA titles, we're seeing, if we look at this 50 FPS line, most of the games can go at or above that at native resolution 1080p medium settings, and then kicking on quality level upscaling. I threw in like Spiderman 2 as an example. Takes you from already a decent experience to a higher refresh rate experience. Whereas there are still less optimized games like Monster Hunter Wilds, where 1080p medium native is well below 50 FPS, but even using upscaling only gets the 3060 up to 50 FPS, and the 5050 is still, I think, a little bit shy of 60 FPS. So it's, there's still going to be those more difficult to run games out there where you're still struggling for that 60 FPS line. Anyway, so this is a more realistic look at how these GPUs are going to play out. So in general, again, looking at something like 1080p medium settings, the 5050 is averaging out 10% faster. So the 5050 is about 10% faster than the RTX 3060 when you're not spilling over 8 gigabytes of VRAM. When you do spill over 8 gigabytes of VRAM, the 3060 comes out faster, which is why in my overall results, my 3060 is coming out averaging 5% faster. But that's because when you run out of VRAM, there can be these massive lopsided victories. But when you look at the actual frame rate numbers they're happening at, we're talking like 20 or 30 FPS experiences where you're probably not going to use those settings anyway. Now, what does this actually look like in games? Because I think that's something that benchmark charts can often kind of hide. So we're going to spend some time, actually every single one of those tests, I have side-by-side footage captured. So let's go ahead and take a look. So if you're trying to play Monster Hunter Wilds at 1080p maximum settings, neither GPU is doing a good job here. 31 FPS on the 3060, 26 on the 5050. So yeah, the 3060 is faster, but it's not a very usable experience. Using DLSS quality, it gets the 3060 to where, 38 FPS, and it's not stuttering because it does have enough VRAM. One thing to look at in the side-by-side footage that you miss in the bar graphs is the frame time graphs. Look how stuttery that is on the 5050. So even if you're achieving a decent frame rate, sometimes the experience is still bad because of stutters and things like that, and missing textures, which we're also seeing here. So not a great experience. 1440p max is even worse, and yeah, the 3060 is faster, but it's only getting 24 FPS itself. Although do note, again, one nice thing about the side-by-side footage is you can point out things like missing textures, where we see that there's no textures here, but there are textures here. So that's another issue with the 8GB cards that you'll have to worry about. So there is certainly a trade-off there, but again, these settings are clearly not appropriate to either GPU. Using DLSS balance gets the 3060 over 30 FPS, so if you're the kind of person who in AAA games is okay with more like a 30 or 40 FPS experience to try to max out the graphics, then actually maybe the 3060, could be offering something to you here. Whereas if you're pushing for more like 60 FPS, even in the big single A, not single A, AAA single player titles, then really the max settings aren't gonna do it for you, even if you have enough VRAM. Anyway, if we drop down to medium settings though, this is where we're gonna see the GPUs are a lot more at home. 1080p medium, it's 39 FPS on the 3060 and 44 on the 5050. 5050 is 13% faster. And if we kick on DLSS quality, we're now getting 50 FPS and 54 FPS. Again, the 5050 is a little bit faster. We don't have missing textures now. And this is the most demanding game that I tested released so far in 2025. 1440p medium, we're talking 30 FPS and 33. The 5050 is 10% faster. And using DLSS balanced, we're getting 41 FPS and 48. The 5050 is 17% faster. It's not an amazing experience, but you could play it at these frame rates if you really want to play the game. Spiderman 2 1080p max settings goes beyond the VRAM capacity, 31 FPS versus 25, stuttery bad 1% lows on both. Honestly, this goes beyond 12 gigabytes of VRAM. Using DLSS quality gets us to 45 versus 30. So again, the 3060 is one of those situations where if you really like pushing graphics settings, but playing at a lower but somewhat acceptable frame rate, like I said, in that kind of 30 to 40 FPS range, the 3060 can do that more comfortably than the 5050 can. Now, at 1440p max settings, it's really just a bad experience, 21 FPS versus 17. And using DLSS balanced, it's still not great, 38 versus 23. But again, the 3060, if you're, again, going for that lower frame rate but higher graphics settings but still playable situation in single-player games, the 3060 is better at that. Using 1080p medium settings, though, both GPUs are fine, 66 FPS versus 75. The 5050 is faster now, though, because we're not running out of VRAM. Medium settings, DLSS quality, we're now a pretty high refresh rate experience for a single-player title at 91 versus 98. Again, the 5050 is faster. And the 1440p medium results are 46 FPS versus 50. It's somewhat playable at native resolution. The 5050 is a bit faster, but using DLSS balanced gets us to 75 versus 72. And now the 3060 is faster again, so I wonder if moving up to 1440p did push us right onto that 8GB VRAM borderline again. Oblivion Remastered at maximum settings doesn't run well on either GPU, even at 1080p. They're tied at 27 FPS. And using DLSS quality gets us to 37 FPS on the 3060, but the 5050 doesn't go any faster because it runs out of VRAM and it's bottlenecked by fetching information across the PCIe bus. 37 FPS isn't a great experience, but again, if you're leaning for that 30 to 40 FPS range to max out graphic settings in single-player titles, the 3060 does do that better than the 5050 does. 1440p max settings, 20 FPS versus 13, I would deem unplayable on both. Balanced level DLSS does get the 3060 up to 32 FPS, whereas the 5050 stuck at 21 and extremely stuttery. So again, one of those situations where if you're going for that 30 FPS mode, the 3060 can handle it while the 5050 can't. But if you go down to medium settings, you're getting 57 FPS versus 55. They're basically tied here. The 3060 is winning by 2 FPS. If we kick on DLSS balanced, it gets us to 61 FPS versus 71, and now the 5050 is winning by 16%. Kingdom Come Deliverance 2, 1080p max settings, neither GPU does well at 24 versus 21. The 3060 is winning though, because we are beyond 8 gigabytes of VRAM. Using DLSS quality, it's 26 versus 27, so it's basically a tie and neither one's doing well. And 1440p max, it's 20 versus 7. So the 3060 is not really playable here, but the 5050 is dying on its VRAM capacity. And DLSS balanced gets the 3060 up to 24, but this is not one of the games where it seems like you're getting to almost 40 FPS and might be playable on the 3060. It's just not good. 1080p medium, though, this game runs great. 80 FPS versus 91. The 5050 is faster, and this game has beautiful frame time graphs and high 1% lows that are super close to the averages. 1440p medium, we're looking at 55 versus 59. 7% advantage for the 5050. And DLSS balanced pushes it to 75 FPS versus 85. 13% advantage for the 5050, and they're both having a good experience. 1080p max settings in Assassin's Creed Shadows. Both GPUs are doing badly, but we are over 8 gigabytes of VRAM again, so the 3060 is a little bit faster, but it's 22 FPS versus 20. Using DLSS quality, it's still only 26 FPS versus 24. So another game where at max settings, even using DLSS, the 3060 can't really reach a very playable experience. And then 1440p max settings were tied at 18 FPS because they're both just not doing well. Now, using max settings with DLSS balanced improves frame rates, but only to 25 FPS versus 24, so it's still not a good experience on either one. And then 1080p medium settings were suddenly a lot more playable. And the 5050 takes the lead actually by 23% here at 58 versus 47. Although I will say that the lighting conditions and weather conditions aren't perfectly matched despite me using the built-in benchmark run here. So I think that might be slightly giving the 5050 a slightly higher lead than we would typically see. You can see that again here in the side-by-side footage. Either way, the 5050 is faster at 45 versus 37. And then using DLSS balance, we're seeing 66 versus 52. Moving on to Clair Obscur Expedition 33, we can see stutters in the 1% lows on the 8GB card at max settings 1080p. And the 3060, though, is losing on average. It has better 1% lows. So using DLSS quality, though, seems to get the 1% lows in control. And the 5050 is ahead in both the averages and the 1% lows now at 61 versus 51. And moving up to max settings 1440p, the 5050 is choking and stuttering on its VRAM capacity, but even the 3060 is only averaging 23 FPS here. Using DLSS balance seems to get both VRAM and performance somewhat under control. This is playable here at 45 FPS and 49, and actually the 5050 is faster here by 9%. Again, not super high refresh rate experience though, so you might prefer the medium settings, which honestly in this game look just about as good as the max settings. And now it's 60 FPS versus 53. The 5050 is winning by 13%. And using 1440p medium settings, it's 41 FPS versus 36. The 5050 is winning by 14%. But you'd probably want to kick on some upscaling here. DLSS balanced gets us to 75 FPS versus 64. The 5050 is winning by 17%. And let's move over to Doom the Dark Ages at 1080p. I'm calling these max settings, but it's max not path tracing. When the game came out, these were the max settings, but they added a path tracing update later. Anyway, 50 FPS versus 45, the 5050 was winning. At max settings, using DLSS quality, we get to 70 FPS versus 62, the 5050 is winning. And using 1440p max settings, we go beyond 8 gigabytes of VRAM, and now the 3060 takes the lead, but it's only 31 FPS versus 29. So not a great experience on either one. For a Doom game, you certainly would want some higher frame rates. But if you kick on DLSS balanced, the 3060 gets up to 49 FPS, even at the Ultra Nightmare settings, so playable, whereas the 5050 is down at 39. Again, we are over 8 gigabytes VRAM here, even using DLSS balanced to modify the internal rendering resolution. Now, using 1080p medium, it's 56 versus 52. The 5050 has the lead. And it's also just about a tie in the 1% lows at 42 versus 41. 1440p medium settings are 37 versus 34. The 5050 is winning, but not by much, and that's overall frame rates are pretty low. Medium settings with DLSS balanced gets us to 61 FPS versus 56, so 9% lead for the 5050. And Final Fantasy VII Rebirth hits 61 FPS on the 5050 and 56 on the 3060, so a bit of a lead here for the 5050. Max settings DLSS quality gets us to 74 versus 66, 12% lead for the 5050. 1440p max is 45 FPS versus 43, 5% lead for the 5050. And 1440p max settings DLSS quality, not balanced here. This is the one game where at 1440p I'm using quality level upscaling, not balanced, because the game actually just doesn't have balanced mode upscaling in it. It just lets you choose the internal rendering resolution at options of 100%, 66%, and 50%. So to avoid going all the way down to performance mode, I chose the quality mode. Anyway, overall performance numbers look pretty good at 58 versus 54, so certainly playable here. Going down to medium settings, at 1080p, we get 70 FPS and 64. And 1440p, it's 53 versus 49. Again, the 5050 leading. 1440p medium DLSS quality, we're at 69 FPS versus 62. And that is all of the benchmarks I ran. Now, if you would like a longer look at all of that side-by-side footage, it is a 52-minute video file. I did upload it to my members feed as an extra. It's not me talking or anything. It's literally just the side-by-side footage uploaded to the members feed as an extra content kind of thing, but you could look at that at your leisure if you would like to look more closely for missing textures on the 8 GB card, or the frame time graphs, and look at what does Ultra look like compared to Medium, that kind of thing. But anyway, what are my overall thoughts here? I mean, my overall thoughts are honestly that you probably shouldn't buy either one of these GPUs right now, at least brand new. So the RTX 5050 is $250. The 3060 still has some new stock available, and make sure you're looking at the 12 GB model. And it's around the same price, $257 here. So they are around the same price on the new market. However, 3060s are more widely available on the used market. If I look at like a eBay average price tracker thing, we can see that 3060 12 GB tend to sell between the $200 and $260 mark is most of the sales volume. If you can get one closer to the $200 mark, now you're getting a card that's like roughly on par with the 5050, a little bit slower in raw performance, but with more VRAM, and you're spending around $200 for that performance level. If you're buying a used 3060, though, be careful paying around the $250 mark, because while it does have more VRAM than the 5050, it's actually a little bit slower. And again, we saw that a lot of the cases where you're using the additional VRAM, overall performance is pretty low. So between the two cards, it's just really hard to be excited about either one of them as far as buying them new right now. I think if you bought a 3060 years ago, it's been holding up pretty dang well. But buying one new, yeah, if you got one closer to $200 used, might be kind of an attractive option there. And again, if you're somebody who plays single-player titles and you like that 30 to 40 FPS, but maxing out the graphic settings as much as possible to get there, the 3060 is better at that than the 5050 is. But the 5050 has a bit more raw performance, so if you're turning down graphic settings anyway to achieve higher frame rates, the 5050 is a little more powerful. That being said, I recently did a comparison of the 5050 up against the 9060 XT 8 GB. It's another 8 GB card, but with significantly more performance. Its average in all of my tests, and it was this same set of games, was 40% faster than the 5050. So that is one of those cases where, okay, if you're going to turn down settings to be within the 8 GB VRAM buffer, you might as well get a high refresh rate experience, and the 9060 XT 8 GB version can do that. Now, in general, if your budget's available, I'd recommend going up to the 16 GB version, but that is a lot more expensive right now, and I understand if your budget just doesn't allow that. Let me double check the 9060 XT 8 GB pricing right now. Yeah, it looks like there are still some of the $270 models available on Amazon, shipped and sold by Amazon, $275 available. And one listed at $250, but that's relying on a $50 promo gift card from Newegg. So that's only useful if you actually are going to use the extra $50 at Newegg. Otherwise, that's not really $250 pricing. But the point is, if you're shopping this kind of $250-ish price tag, I do think that going up to that 9060 XT 16 GB version is probably the better choice. And again, I do have a video with the same set of games head-to-head against the 5050, so I recommend checking that out. Hopefully you guys found the video useful and or interesting, and I hope all of you have an excellent day.